He had always dreamed of owning a home that felt like a safe place where he could retreat from the noise of the world and simply live his life. After years of saving and careful planning, he finally founded a modest house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and well-kept yards. On his first walk around the area, he noticed children playing on the sidewalks, neighbors chatting across fences, and the general calm that comes from a community that seems to care about itself. It felt perfect. He signed the papers, moved in, and for a while, everything seemed just as he had imagined. At first, the Homeowners Association, or HOA as it was called, seemed like a helpful presence. They sent out newsletters about community events, reminders about maintaining lawns, and guidelines about keeping the neighborhood looking clean and organized. He read them carefully and followed every rule. Every lawn was neatly mowed, every fence painted, every tree pruned according to the rules. He wanted to be a good neighbor. He wanted to belong. For the first few months, life was peaceful. He painted the front porch, planted flowers, and even helped a neighbor fix a broken fence. It felt good to be part of something, to contribute, and to live in a place that seemed to value order and beauty. Then, one morning, everything began to change. A letter arrived in the mailbox. The paper was official, stamped with the HOA's logo, and the tone was cold and formal. It stated that he had violated a community rule. He read it carefully, again and again. The violation seemed minor at first, almost trivial. It said his driveway had a small crack and that some weeds near the side of the house needed to be removed. He looked around the property, confused. The crack had been there since he bought the house, and the weeds he had just pulled out last week. He assumed it must be a simple mistake, maybe someone reporting it by accident. He called the HOA office to explain, hoping it would be resolved quickly. The person on the phone was polite but rigid, repeating the same phrases. "We expect compliance. The violation must be corrected immediately. Failure to comply could result in fines." He tried to explain that he had already taken care of the issue, that the crack in the driveway was minor and not unsafe. But they insisted that he follow the proper process. He hung up feeling uneasy. The friendly, peaceful neighborhood he had loved now felt cold and hostile. Over the next few weeks, more letters came. Each one was stricter than the last. They accused him of not mowing his lawn according to their standards, of leaving trash cans visible for too long, of planting flowers that were non-compliant. He looked around and compared his yard to his neighbor's, and everything seemed similar, if not better. The accusations felt unfair, but he tried to remain calm. He took photos, kept notes, and continued to follow every rule to the letter. He believed that if he stayed careful and reasonable, the HOA would eventually see that he was compliant. But then, things escalated. One morning, as he was leaving for work, he noticed a car parked near his driveway with no one inside. Later, he found another letter slipped under his door, claiming that the HOA had observed unauthorized modifications to the property. He checked everything. Walking around every corner of his house, inside and out, there was nothing unusual. Nothing had changed. He began to feel a knot of anxiety growing in his chest. The letters became more frequent, the tone harsher. They spoke of fines that would accumulate, daily legal action if he didn't comply, and enforcement visits to the property. He felt trapped. At first, he tried to reach out to his neighbors, thinking someone might understand or have advice. But the neighbors were quiet. Some shook their heads and said they didn't want to get involved. Others muttered about how the HOA could be difficult, but no one had fought back. The silence around him was deafening. He realized that he was facing this challenge mostly alone. The community he had admired now felt like a network of observers, some fearful, some indifferent, and none willing to stand with him. He began documenting everything. Every letter, every phone call, every interaction. He took photographs of his property, recorded dates and times, and wrote detailed notes about the conversations with the HOA. Every step he took cautiously, knowing that any misstep could be used against him. He even started marking his calendar with when letters arrived and when he responded. The process was exhausting, but he refused to be intimidated. He wanted to protect his home, his sanctuary. It's a place where he had imagined building his life. Weeks turned into months, and the stress began to take a toll. Sleep became difficult. He woke in the middle of the night, imagining another letter, another fine, another accusation. He felt the weight of constant surveillance pressing down on him. His mind raced with what-if questions. What if the fines keep growing? What if they accuse him of something he didn't do? What if they try to take his home away? The anxiety was invisible to the neighbors who walked past, cheerful in their routines. Unaware of the battles quietly raging behind the doors of a house that looked ordinary from the street, despite the stress, he tried to maintain normal life. He worked, cooked, cleaned, and sometimes even smiled, pretending that nothing was wrong. But each new letter, each phone call, was a reminder that his peace had been shattered. The rules of the HOA seemed endless, shifting, and sometimes contradictory. One notice would say a fence needed repair, another would criticize the exact way he had repaired it. It felt like he was playing a game with rules he could never fully understand, and referees who changed their minds at every turn at some point. He realized that the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were targeting him. The letters became personal, pointing out small details of his life that no one else seemed to notice. It wasn't just about the property anymore. It was about control, about power. He had never expected that a neighborhood organization, meant to protect and maintain the community, could become an antagonist. He felt betrayed, confused, and frustrated. How could a place that promised safety and community turn into a source of fear and stress? He began talking to professionals, trying to understand his rights, trying to see if there was any legal way to stop the harassment. He learned about how HOAs operated, about the loopholes they sometimes exploited, and about the few homeowners who had successfully stood up against them. Each story he read gave him a small spark of hope, but also a warning. Fighting an HOA could be long, exhausting, and expensive, but he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't allow years of investment, both emotional and financial, to be destroyed by an organization that seemed untouchable. One morning, he decided to walk around the neighborhood and take a deeper look. He noticed the subtle ways the HOA monitored homes, surveillance cameras in common areas, notes about residents' activities posted on bulletin boards, complaints quietly passed along from neighbor to neighbor. He realized that his home, his sanctuary, had been placed under a microscope. Every flower he planted, every tree he trimmed, every repair he made could be scrutinized, judged, and used against him. He felt a strange combination of anger and fear. His life had been invaded. Yet the world outside the walls of his home seemed unaware. He also began noticing the psychological toll it was taking. He had moments of doubt, wondering if he was overreacting, if he had somehow misunderstood the rules. But the consistent pattern of letters and accusations proved otherwise. He realized that the problem wasn't him, it was the HOA. They were the ones who had escalated from simple notices to harassment. They were the ones controlling the narrative, shaping the environment to intimidate, isolate, and pressure him. And they were succeeding, at least partially. He felt isolated, trapped, and constantly anxious, even in the place he loved most. Still, he tried to maintain hope. He believed that the truth would eventually come out. He believed that if he stayed careful, documented everything, and followed the law, he could protect his home. Every day, he made small steps, fixing minor things before they became violations, photographing repairs, writing letters to the HOA for every interaction. It was exhausting, repetitive, and sometimes disheartening, but he refused to give up. His home wasn't just property, it was a part of his life, a symbol of his hard work, and a source of peace that he could not relinquish. Friends and family noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more tense, and often distracted. They didn't fully understand what he was going through, but they offered support in small ways, listening to his frustrations. Helping with repairs and occasionally accompanying him to HOA meetings, their presence reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone, that there were people who cared and who believed in his right to defend his home. Those small moments of solidarity gave him strength to face another day. Another letter, another fine. It was during one of these long, Tense nights that he sat at his kitchen table with all the letters, notices, and photos spread in front of him. He realized he was at the start of a battle he hadn't chosen, but one he had to fight. The letters weren't just paperwork. They were symbols of control, intimidation, and abuse of power. He made a silent promise to himself that he would not let them win, that he would protect his home, and that he would do everything possible to restore peace and justice. Looking around his home, he felt a mix of sadness and determination. The place that had once brought joy now carried anxiety, but it also carried hope, the hope that perseverance, careful documentation, and courage could overcome harassment. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he could not abandon what he had worked so hard to build. His sanctuary, his refuge, his home was worth every ounce of effort, and he was ready to face whatever came next. And so, the first chapter of his struggle ended not with victory, but with awareness. He had learned that appearances could be deceiving, that a friendly neighborhood could hide unseen threats, that even in a place of peace, conflict could arise without warning. The quiet home he had once loved had become the battleground of a fight he had no choice but to face, and he prepared himself for the challenges that lay ahead. Determined to reclaim the sense of safety and control that had first drawn him to the place, he called home after weeks of growing unease. The situation began to change in ways he had never imagined. What had started as letters and warnings quickly escalated into something far more invasive. One morning, he returned from work to find a notice taped to his front door. It wasn't the usual formal letter. This one was shorter, more threatening. Spoke of immediate action required for violations that he had never even been aware of. His stomach sank. He walked around the property carefully, inspecting every corner, every fence, every tree. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Nothing had changed, but that didn't matter to the HOA. The notice claimed that certain bushes were overgrown beyond acceptable limits, and that some minor decorative items were non-compliant. I knew that they were exaggerating. The bushes had been trimmed just last week, and the decorations had been approved by a previous board member. It felt as though someone had invented rules overnight just to punish him. He tried calling the office, hoping to speak to someone reasonable. The receptionist answered politely, but quickly passed the call to someone higher. The voice on the other end was cold and clipped. "You must comply," the person said. "There is no room for debate. Violations will result in fines and enforcement visits." It was then that he realized this wasn't about rules anymore. This was about control. The HOA wasn't simply enforcing guidelines. They were targeting him personally. Every small detail of his property, every personal choice he made about how to maintain it, was under scrutiny. He felt a creeping sense of paranoia. Every time he trimmed a bush, painted a fence, or even opened his front door, he wondered if someone was watching, taking notes, waiting to issue the next violation. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The first actual intrusion happened quietly. One afternoon, as he was checking his mailbox, he noticed footprints in the freshly planted flower bed. They were faint, but unmistakable. Someone had walked through his property without permission. Panic set in. He called the HOA immediately, demanding to know who had entered his yard. The response was dismissive. "Routine inspection," they said. No one entered unlawfully, but he knew better. He had security cameras installed, and the footage later confirmed his fears. HOA staff had walked across his property without warning, damaging some plants in the process, claiming it was necessary for compliance checks. It was a turning point. The intrusion wasn't just symbolic. It was real, tangible, and damaging. He realized that his home was no longer fully his. Every visit from the HOA brought anxiety, uncertainty, and a growing sense of helplessness. At first, he tried to meet them halfway. He repaired minor issues, trimmed every bush, repainted fences, and removed decorative items that might cause trouble. He documented everything meticulously, photographing each fix, each alteration. Yet, the fines continued. Every effort seemed to be met with a new accusation, a fresh violation, a louder threat. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Some offered sympathetic smiles, some whispered warnings about how the HOA had treated others. But few were willing to get involved. The silence of the neighborhood was heavy. It felt like everyone was watching, but no one dared to intervene. He realized that the HOA wielded power not only through rules and fines, but also through fear. If he could be targeted, anyone could be. The quiet streets, once comforting, now felt like a theater where he was constantly on display. Judged by invisible eyes, one morning he returned home to a scene that made his heart drop. A large tree in his backyard, one that had provided shade and beauty for years, had been cut down. Not pruned, not trimmed, cut down completely. There was no warning, no explanation. The HOA had deemed it non-compliant with community standards. He stood there stunned, staring at the stump. Years of planning, of planting, of enjoying its presence, were gone in an instant. He felt rage, disbelief, and grief all at once. How could an organization destroy property with such ease, without consent, without accountability? He tried to speak to the board members directly, hoping for understanding, or at least negotiation. But every attempt ended with a polite dismissal or a vague statement about community rules. It became clear that the destruction wasn't accidental or necessary, it was intentional. The HOA was sending a message. They wanted him to feel powerless, to comply without question, and to abandon his home, determined not to give in. He started documenting everything more aggressively. He set up additional cameras, started keeping a daily log of every event, and took photographs of every inch of his property before and after any HOA visit. He began noting dates, times, names of individuals who entered, and the specific actions taken. The process was exhausting. He spent hours each day ensuring that he had proof of everything, knowing that someday might be the only way to fight back. The emotional toll was significant. He began waking up in the middle of the night, anxious about what he might find the next morning. Every sound, footsteps, a truck, a strange car made him tense. He avoided the front porch at certain times, worried someone might be watching. Meals became hurried, interrupted by thoughts of inspections, fines, and letters. He had to force himself to leave the house, to go to work, to interact with the world outside. But even then, the shadow of the HOA lingered. His sanctuary had become a source of stress. At the same time, he discovered that the HOA was not just affecting him, they were affecting the community. Other neighbors had experienced similar, though less extreme actions. Fines for minor issues, sudden enforcement visits, and aggressive letters were common. Yet many chose to remain silent, fearful of retaliation. The culture of fear was pervasive. He realized he was not alone, but standing up might make him a bigger target. The thought was frightening, but it also gave him a sense of purpose. If he could challenge the HOA, he could protect not just himself, but others too. One particularly stressful incident occurred when the HOA decided to remove a small shed from his backyard. The shed had been there for years, used for storing tools and gardening equipment. The HOA claimed it was unauthorized and visually disruptive. He had paperwork proving it was approved when he bought the house, but the board ignored it. Early one morning, without warning, workers arrived and dismantled the shed. He watched in disbelief, unable to stop them. Tools were damaged, personal belongings were scattered, and years of careful organization were ruined. The financial loss was substantial, but the emotional loss was even greater. The place he had once called home was being dismantled piece by piece. He began speaking to legal advisors, trying to understand what could be done. He learned that HOAs had extensive power, but there were limits. They could not enter property without notice, could not destroy personal property, and there were rules about fines and enforcement. Yet, the practicalities were daunting. Fighting legally would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Most people gave up before reaching a resolution. He understood the risks, but he also knew that giving up was not an option. His home was worth the struggle. As he prepared for the legal battle, he also started reaching out to neighbors more seriously. Some were willing to share their experiences quietly, confirming that the HOA's behavior was part of a pattern. Others were too afraid to speak, fearing fines or retaliation. He began to understand the depth of the problem. This wasn't just a personal conflict, it was a systemic issue within the HOA. They had created a culture where fear was a tool. Compliance was enforced through intimidation. And personal property could be taken with little consequence. Amid all the stress and destruction, he also found moments of clarity. He realized that the HOA's actions were motivated by control, not by concern for the neighborhood. He understood that his fight would not be simple or easy, but he also felt a sense of moral responsibility. If he could document, prove, and challenge their actions, he could set a precedent. He could show that even powerful organizations were not above accountability. This thought gave him strength during the darkest moments, when it seemed that every letter, every fine, every destroyed tree was designed to break him. The community, once a place of comfort, had become a stage for a battle he never sought. Each day brought new challenges: inspections, letters, threats of fines, and small acts of destruction. Yet, with every challenge, he learned more about the limits of the HOA, about the law, and about his own resilience. The fight was taking a toll, but it was also shaping him into someone prepared to stand against injustice. His home was no longer just a place to live. It had become a symbol of perseverance, courage, and determination. The months passed slowly. Each day felt long, filled with anxiety and the constant need to be vigilant. Yet despite the pressure, he refused to let the HOA succeed. Every act of destruction, every threatening letter, every attempt to intimidate him only strengthened his resolve. He began keeping detailed records, meeting with legal experts, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The battle had shifted from the yard and the mailbox to a larger, more important fight for justice, fairness, and accountability. And so, what began as letters about minor violations evolved into a sustained campaign of harassment and property destruction. He had entered the second stage of the battle, facing not only a powerful organization, but also the emotional strain that came with it. Each act of destruction was a test of his patience, courage, and determination. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he also knew he could not turn back. The fight for his home had become a fight for his dignity, his peace of mind, and the principle that no one should be allowed to destroy someone else's life under the guise of rules and authority. By the time he reached the third stage of his battle, he had learned one painful truth: the HOA would not stop on its own. They had already crossed boundaries, destroyed property, and made his life miserable. Compliance alone was no longer enough. Letters, warnings, and fines continued despite his careful adherence to every rule. It was clear that the fight could no longer be avoided. If he wanted peace, if he wanted his home to remain his, he had to take action. He began by organizing all the evidence he had collected over the months. Each letter, each photograph, each note became a piece of a larger puzzle. The pictures of the destroyed tree, the dismantled shed, the footprints in his flower beds, all were carefully cataloged and dated. He spent hours reviewing video footage from his cameras, noting the exact time staff entered his property, what they did, and whether they had given any prior notice. He even made copies of emails and letters, printing everything multiple times to ensure nothing could be lost or overlooked. The sheer amount of material was overwhelming, but he knew this was the foundation of his fight. Next came the legal research. He spent long nights reading about homeowners' rights, HOA regulations, and past cases where HOS had been challenged. Some cases had ended in victory, but many had been dismissed. It was discouraging, but he focused on the hope that perseverance and solid evidence could make a difference. He began reaching out to lawyers who specialized in property law, trying to find someone willing to take on what they often described as a difficult and uphill battle. Many declined, citing the high cost and low chance of success. It was frustrating to realize that even those who helped others legally were hesitant to confront the HOA's power. Finally, he found a lawyer who agreed to represent him. The lawyer had experience with cases involving abusive homeowners associations and seemed genuinely committed to justice. They began by reviewing all the documentation he had collected, discussing strategies, and planning how to present the evidence in a compelling way. The lawyer explained that the case would likely take months, maybe even years, but the potential outcome could be life-changing. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. He was no longer fighting blindly. He had someone in his corner and a plan to fight back. Even with legal help, the emotional toll of the battle was immense. Every interaction with the HOA was tense. Phone calls that used to make him anxious now felt like tests of patience and composure. Each letter, though carefully read and documented, still carried the sting of intimidation. He found himself reliving the destruction over and over: the fallen tree, the dismantled shed, the damaged plants. At times it felt unbearable. Friends and family noticed the strain. Some tried to offer advice while others simply listened. Their support was small but meaningful. It reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone, that he still had allies in a world that sometimes seemed stacked against him. One day, a new threat arrived in the mailbox. A notice demanding immediate compliance for a violation that he knew was fabricated, something about a non-compliant fence decoration that had been in place for years. He read the letter slowly, taking notes, and immediately called his lawyer. They discussed the best approach: respond formally, document the conversation. Damned. Prepare to use this as evidence of ongoing harassment. Each interaction with the HOA was now both a stressor and an opportunity to strengthen his case. The mental load was exhausting, but he knew he had to be meticulous. Mistakes could weaken the entire fight. He also started paying closer attention to the psychological aspects of the battle. The HOA's tactics were not just physical, they were emotional. Their letters were designed to intimidate, to make him feel isolated and powerless. But he refused to let fear dominate. He practiced mindfulness, took long walks, and tried to maintain routines that reminded him of life beyond the HOA. He focused on small victories, like successfully trimming his yard, without receiving a new violation or documenting an inspection that could later be used in court. These small moments of control helped balance the constant stress and gave him the strength to keep moving forward. As the case developed, he began discovering patterns in the HOA's behavior. They were selective, targeting only certain homeowners who were seen as resistant. They relied on bureaucracy, expecting people to give up under the weight of paperwork, fines, and harassment. They exploited fear, hoping that no one would challenge them. Understanding these patterns became crucial. He could anticipate their next moves, prepare responses, and avoid being caught off guard. Knowledge became his weapon, alongside the meticulous documentation he had collected over months. There were also moments of doubt. Sometimes he wondered if he had underestimated the difficulty of fighting a powerful organization. The fines were accumulating, the legal fees were high, and the emotional exhaustion was real. On some nights, he would lie awake imagining the worst-case scenarios: losing the case, being forced to sell the home, or watching the HOA continue its destruction without consequences. Those thoughts were frightening, but he never allowed them to dictate his actions. Instead, he focused on the concrete steps he could take: organizing evidence, consulting his lawyer, and staying consistent in his responses. Community support, though limited, began to play a role. A few neighbors who had quietly observed the HOA's behavior reached out, offering testimony about similar incidents. Some provided written statements, while others shared experiences that mirrored his own. Each piece of corroboration strengthened his case and reinforced the truth. He was not exaggerating. He was not imagining harassment. The HOA's behavior was systematic, targeted, and abusive. Having neighbors willing to step forward, even cautiously, made him feel less isolated and more confident that he could eventually hold the organization accountable. As the legal strategy developed, he also started thinking about long-term implications. He realized this fight was not only about his own property, but also about setting a precedent for other homeowners. If he succeeded, it would send a message that abuse of power by an HOA could have consequences. It would provide hope to others who had felt trapped or intimidated. This thought gave him purpose beyond his own struggles. The fight became not just personal, but principled. He was standing for fairness, accountability, the basic right to protect one's home. The preparation phase was exhausting and detailed. He met with his lawyer multiple times a week, reviewing evidence, drafting formal complaints, and anticipating counterarguments from the HOA. Each document needed to be perfect. Every photograph clear, every date accurate. Small errors could be exploited by the opposition. The process demanded precision, patience, and unwavering focus. At times he felt overwhelmed, but he reminded himself why he had started this journey: to reclaim control, dignity, and peace. Each completed document, each organized folder of evidence, was a small victory in itself. Even with legal guidance, confrontations with the HOA were inevitable. Staff continued to appear unannounced, inspecting property, issuing fines, and attempting to intimidate. Every encounter required calm, professionalism, and careful documentation. He learned to remain composed even when provoked. He never responded in anger, knowing that any emotional reaction could be twisted against him in court. Instead, he recorded, photographed, and reported, building a chain of evidence that clearly demonstrated the OA's misconduct. There were moments of encouragement, too. Sometimes, the HOA would fail to follow their own procedures, making errors that strengthened his case. Occasionally, a sympathetic board member would quietly acknowledge the unfairness of the actions. These small signs of justice, though rare, reminded him that the fight was not hopeless. They provided reassurance that persistence, documentation, preparation could overcome even a powerful and relentless organization. The emotional aspect remained intense. He often felt anger, frustration, and exhaustion. Yet he also found determination, focus, and resilience he hadn't known he possessed. He spent long evenings talking to friends and family about his experiences, processing emotions, and gaining perspective. Sharing the burden, even in small ways, helped him maintain mental clarity. He also began journaling, writing down every thought, every fear, and every plan. The journal became a tool for reflection, strategy, and emotional release. Months passed, and the battle took on a rhythm. Letters would arrive, inspections would happen, fines would be threatened, and he would respond meticulously. It was exhausting, repetitive, and stressful, but he had developed a routine. Each day was a test of patience, resilience, and strategic thinking. He had transformed from a homeowner simply trying to comply into someone prepared to defend rights, challenge abuse, and hold a powerful organization accountable. The process changed him, deepening his understanding of justice, responsibility, personal courage. By this point, he was no longer just fighting for his own property. The experience had awakened a broader awareness of how easily organizations can abuse power when individuals remain silent. He began thinking about ways to educate others, to provide guidance and support to homeowners facing similar situations. The personal struggle had become a mission, a purpose that extended beyond his own home. His resolve grew stronger with every challenge, every fine, and every threat. As the legal proceedings began to take shape, he felt a mix of fear and hope. Fear because the HOA was powerful, unpredictable, and relentless. Hope because he had meticulously documented every act, consulted experienced legal counsel, and gathered supportive witnesses. He understood the battle would be long, the outcome uncertain, and the stress unrelenting. Yet, he was determined to see it through. This fight was about reclaiming control, dignity, and peace. And he refused to let intimidation dictate the course of his life. The third stage of his journey ended with preparation and resolve. He was ready to move from passive documentation to active confrontation. He had learned the importance of strategy, the value of meticulous evidence, and the strength that comes from refusing to yield to injustice. His home, once threatened and diminished, had become a symbol of resistance. The next steps would determine not only his personal future, but also set the stage for accountability, fairness, and the possibility of change within a community that had been overshadowed by fear. The day finally came when he stepped into the courtroom. For months, he had prepared meticulously, gathering evidence, organizing photographs, and coordinating with his lawyer. Every document, every video clip, every witness statement had been carefully reviewed. Despite all the preparation, his heart raced. Courtrooms had a way of making even the most confident people feel small and powerless. The weight of the past months pressed on him: the destroyed tree, the dismantled shed, the endless letters and fines. He knew this was the moment when all of it would be tested. From the first steps into the courtroom, he felt the tension in the air. The room was quiet, filled with murmurs from the few spectators, the HOA representatives, and their lawyers. He noticed the board members sitting together, confident, as though nothing could shake them. Their posture said power, control, and certainty. He, on the other hand, carried months of frustration, worry, and a strong determination to prove the truth. Every violation, every act of property destruction, every letter and fine was going to be laid bare in front of people who had the authority to enforce justice. The proceedings began with formal introductions. Lawyers presented the case, laying out the basic facts. He had purchased his property, followed all rules, and yet the HOA had repeatedly issued fines, entered his property without permission, and destroyed parts of his home. Each claim was supported with documentation, photographs of damage, videos of unannounced inspections, and letters that proved repeated harassment. He watched as his lawyer carefully explained the significance of each piece of evidence, connecting them to the broader pattern of abuse. It was more than just individual incidents. It was a clear attempt to intimidate, control, and punish him. As the case unfolded, witnesses were called. Neighbors who had quietly observed the HOA's behavior stepped forward, sometimes nervously, but resolutely. They described seeing HOA staff entering properties without notice, issuing fines for minor or fabricated violations, and using fear to enforce compliance. Some spoke of their own experiences, explaining that they had chosen to stay silent for fear of retaliation. His lawyer emphasized that his case was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of systemic abuse. The courtroom listened intently, the weight of the testimony slowly changing the atmosphere. The most intense moments came when he recounted the destruction of his property. He described calmly and clearly how the large tree in his backyard had been cut down without warning, how the shed had been dismantled while he watched, tools damaged, belongings scattered, how small decorations and plants had been removed or destroyed. He showed photographs, pointing out the care and effort he had invested in each aspect of his property. There was no exaggeration. Every image, every detail was documented. The courtroom fell silent as the reality of his experiences became undeniable. Experts were called to testify as well. Arborists confirmed that the tree was healthy and posed no threat to property or neighbors. Contractors spoke about the shed, explaining that it had been legally permitted and in excellent condition. Legal experts outlined the HOA's responsibilities and limits, explaining how the organization had clearly overstepped its authority. Each expert added weight to his claims, reinforcing that the violations were not minor misunderstandings, but deliberate harmful actions. The evidence was overwhelming, and slowly, the tide began to turn in his favor. At one point, former HOA board members were asked to testify. Their testimonies were revealing. Some contradicted one another, unable to explain why certain actions were taken or why they ignored rules and approvals that had been in place. Others admitted to decisions that, while framed as routine enforcement, were actually motivated by personal bias or preference. The contradictions were subtle but significant, showing that the HOA's claims of fairness and consistency were false. Every answer, every hesitation, worked in his favor, building a clear picture of intentional misconduct. Throughout the proceedings, he remained calm, even as the memories of the harassment and destruction resurfaced. It was difficult, reliving the moments of fear, anger, and helplessness. But he knew that presenting the truth clearly and without emotion would strengthen his case. Each time a photograph was shown, a video played, or a letter read aloud, he felt a sense of vindication. The months of documentation, preparation, and perseverance were finally paying off. He was no longer a homeowner fighting alone. He was a person presenting an undeniable record of injustice. The HOA lawyers tried to defend their actions, claiming that everything had been within regulations and that any destruction or fines were justified. But their arguments were weak, often contradicted by documentation and witness testimony. Every claim they made was met with evidence showing the opposite: letters proving violations were fabricated, videos showing unannounced property entry, and photographs of destroyed personal property. The contrast between their confident statements and the clear evidence of misconduct was stark. The courtroom atmosphere shifted subtly, as the power dynamic began to favor him rather than the organization. One of the most significant moments came when the judge asked direct questions. The judge's tone was firm but fair, probing the details of each incident, seeking clarity. He answered carefully, focusing on facts, dates, and documented evidence. His lawyer guided him through each response, ensuring that the story remained coherent, consistent, and credible. The judge's attentive listening was a relief. It was clear that this was not going to be dismissed lightly. Every detail mattered, and the judge appeared genuinely interested in understanding the full scope of the HOA's actions. As the hearings progressed, the emotional strain became evident even to him. It was exhausting to recount the harassment and destruction over and over, to watch images of his own home being displayed as evidence, and to face the people responsible without losing composure. Yet, there was also a growing sense of empowerment. For the first time in months, he felt that the struggle was no longer one-sided. The truth was out in the open, visible to those with the authority to enforce accountability. The fight for justice was no longer abstracted. It was real, concrete, and unfolding before him. Witnesses described the broader impact of the HOA's actions on the community. Stories of neighbors who had been intimidated, fined, or harassed created a larger context, demonstrating that his experience was not unique. The judge and court attendees began to see the pattern, an organization that had used rules not to maintain order, but to enforce fear. The testimony was compelling, and the more evidence was presented, the harder it became for the HOA to maintain their defense. Their credibility was eroding, piece by piece. Under the weight of facts and first-hand accounts, perhaps, the most emotional testimony came from those neighbors who had initially stayed silent out of fear. They described watching the destruction of his property, feeling helpless, but now expressing relief at finally being able to speak. Their courage to step forward reinforced the sense of injustice and highlighted the courage it took for him to fight back in the first place. Each voice, each story, strengthened the overall narrative, making it impossible for the HOA to claim that their actions were isolated incidents or misunderstandings.